Looks good. People are signing on.
Yep.
People are early.
Yeah, we will probably start in 1 or 2 minutes. All right. It seems like we are having the attendees joined. So let's get it started. Welcome everyone to this session. This is an hour-long session on Census 2020. We will be having 2 speakers, 2 presentations. Each will be having 25 minutes to give their presentations. Now I will invite our first speaker, David Van Riper. David is the Director of Spatial Analysis at the Institute for Social Research and Data Innovation at MPC. He will be giving a presentation on differential privacy and its impact on the accuracy of the 2020 census data. So David, you're welcome on the stage.
Great, thanks, Mohsen. I'm going to share my screen and get going here. Make sure I have the right presentation. All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this presentation. I'm just going to change my screen layout. Okay. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about differential privacy and the 2020 US Census. And I want to talk a little bit about what you as potential users of 2020 census data need to know about the new disclosure avoidance techniques that the Census Bureau is using. So I want to first start by just giving a little bit of shout out to the groups that have been supporting this research. The Minnesota Population Center, the National Science Foundation, and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation have funded a lot of the research that we've done here at the Minnesota Population Center on this particular topic. So the Census Bureau for a long time has used various methods of disclosure avoidance to protect the confidentiality and privacy of respondents. In the 1960s and 70s and 1980s, the Census Bureau has used a technique called suppression, where they would simply not publish information if the cell sizes for particular counts were too small. And here we have a screenshot of some income statistics from the 1970 census. And you can see these 3 dots here that I've highlighted in red. The mean number of related children under 6 years old were simply not reported for these census tracts, and they just suppressed them so that you couldn't figure out what families in the census tract met these conditions. In the 1990s and 2000s and 2010s, the Census Bureau developed what they called swapping. And this was the disclosure avoidance technique they've used up through the 2010 Decennial Census, and they continue to use in the American Community Survey. And in swapping, the Census Bureau would identify households that were outliers or had unique characteristics relative to other households in a census block or census tract. And they would find similar households somewhere else in a county or in a state, and they would simply swap those households across geographic entities. So to see how that works, I've highlighted in my housing unit in St. Paul in yellow, and I have a second household in another block that's just a little bit farther away from me. And if I was living in a household that the Bureau deemed at risk of being identified, they would simply exchange the demographic characteristics of my household with the demographic characteristics of a similar household in a nearby geographic entity. Now, not all the characteristics would necessarily be matching when you're swapping households. So you might swap a 4-person household for another 4-person household, but the ages of the individuals might be a little different, or maybe the race or ethnicity of 1 or 2 household members didn't quite match. But the Bureau did the best they could to actually match these characteristics, and then they would swap those households. So this is what's been done up until recently. And then in the middle of the past decade, the Bureau carried out a reconstruction and re-identification experiment on the 2010 Decennial Census to see whether or not the techniques they've been using for disclosure avoidance were working well enough, or whether or not they needed to make modifications. So I want to go through a little bit about what this experiment showed, and then we'll talk a little bit about the new disclosure avoidance technique that the Bureau is using. So a reconstruction and re-identification experiment starts from census block level data or census tract level data. So the Bureau started with a set of tables from at the block or tract level. And here we have an example of what a table would look like. We have a block ID of 1001. It has 10 people in it. There's 4 males and 6 females. The Bureau took this information and they essentially constructed individuals from these counts. So now I have 6 females listed and 4 males listed. So I've converted the aggregate counts into individual level records for this particular block. The Bureau then, so after they did the reconstruction, they then took a commercial data set and tried to figure out whether or not the people that they reconstructed from the published tables had any matches in the commercial data set. So on the left-hand side here, we have the reconstructed table from the published counts. And on the right-hand side, we have the data from the commercial data product. So we have 2 unique fields, two shared fields on these. We have block ID and sex on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we have block ID, sex, and name. And the Bureau simply tried to match individuals in these 2 data sets. And they did it on more than just block and sex. They also did it on age. I didn't want to clutter the slide very much, but they did this linkage exercise. And here you can see that for 9 of the records in our reconstructed data, there was a match in the commercial data set. And you'll see there's 1 record where we have a female in the reconstructed data, and there's not another female in the commercial data. Instead, there's a male. So that would be a match that there's no match for that particular example. They then took those 9 records from the commercial data that they had flagged, and they took those commercial data inside the firewall at the Census Bureau and tried to link it back to the confidential 2010 census returns that also had names on them. And they wanted to see how many of those individuals from their re-identification could be linked to the confidential data. And here you can see that the Census Bureau, of those 9 records that they had found matches for, 4 of them matched on block ID, sex, and name. We've got the Aaliyah Cordova in the commercial data matches to the Aaliyah Cordova in the confidential data. So in terms of the re-identification results of this experiment, the Bureau was able to reconstruct 308 million individual records from the 2010 Decennial Census. Of those 308 million individuals, they were able to link 139 million of those records to the commercial database on block ID, sex, and age. And of those 139 million links in the commercial data, they were able to link the 52 million of those cases to the confidential internal census data. So the Bureau states that they were able to re-identify 17% of the 2010 decennial census respondents in this re-identification experiment. Now, of course, that 17% re-identification can only be confirmed if you have access to the confidential data, which has names on it. Now, anyone outside the Census Bureau, we don't get access to that. We have no way of knowing whether or not the matches are confirmed, but the Bureau does have access to that. So the 17% re-identification rate was substantially higher than prior re-identification experiments that the Bureau had undertaken. And this led them to state and claim that traditional disclosure avoidance techniques do not satisfy the Title 13 privacy protections that the Bureau operates under, and that they would have to adopt new disclosure avoidance techniques in order to meet the Title 13 privacy protections that the Bureau operates under. And the Bureau decided to adopt a new technique based on this concept of differential privacy, which has come out of computer science and cryptography, and use it as the way to protect the privacy and confidentiality of 2020 decennial respondents. So what is this differential privacy, and what does this mean for the 2020 decennial census data that's now being released? So differential privacy is a formal or a mathematical definition of privacy. It was developed in a paper published in 2006. So it's about 15 years old now. And it's essentially a way to account for the amount of privacy that is leaked when data sets are published. And it's pretty technical and quite mathematical, and even I, after 2 years of studying it, don't fully understand the math behind the concept. But essentially, you are trying to limit. You set an upper limit on the amount of information that's leaked, and you just can't go over that limit. And to more fully explain this, I want to go through a quick example of how this actually works in practice. I think it will help explain how differential privacy is implemented, and that will kind of show you what that will look like. So I have a toy example here that will help explain how differential privacy is actually implemented in practice, which will kind of help you understand what's going on in the 2020 data. So here I have results from a survey. There are 2 questions on the survey. What sex do you identify as? And what's your school history? Have you never attended school? Are you currently attending school? Or did you attend school in the past? So we have 100 respondents from this survey, and we take the true responses and we create a cross tabulation from the survey responses. So I've taken the individual level records and I've constructed a contingency table from it. So we have 3 males who've never attended school, 17 females who are currently attending school, and 31 females who attended school in the past. So this is our true cross tabulation. In order to protect the privacy of the respondents, how differential privacy typically works is you draw a value from a statistical distribution and you inject that value as noise into these true counts. So we have 6 cells in this contingency table. What we would do is we would draw 6 values from a particular statistical distribution, and we would draw 1 value for each cell in the table, and we would then inject that into the count, and that would essentially protect the privacy of the individuals who responded to the survey. In this example, in the traditional differential privacy world, they use a Laplace distribution, and the amount of noise, the magnitude of the noise that can be injected is determined by this parameter called epsilon, which I'll mention later. And epsilon has a inverse relationship with the noise. So the smaller the value of epsilon is, the larger the noise that gets injected into counts tends to be. And the larger that epsilon is, the smaller the magnitude of the noise that gets injected into the count. So high epsilon means more accuracy, less noise. Low epsilon means higher noise and lower accuracy in terms of the counts that are published. So we add noise to the crosstab, and you'll see in a number of cases, the noise values don't really impact the counts very much. So the male never attended goes from 3 down to 2. The males attending school stays 12 because we injected 0 into it. But you'll see that you can get some big changes. So females who've never attended school increase from 4 up to 12. And the overall N of the survey has changed from 100 up to 108. So now we no longer have a direct one-to-one comparison with the true responses to the data and the noisy values that have come out of this differentially privatized version of the contingency table. So that's typically how differential privacy works. And this is a very simplified example of what the Census Bureau is doing for protecting the 2020 decennial counts. But embedded within that, what I just talked about, there's a ton of policy decisions that I want to talk about now that will hopefully help you understand why you might be seeing the counts that you're seeing in the 2020 data. So the first thing the Bureau has to decide on is the global privacy loss budget. So how much noise do they want to inject into the counts? And this is that value of epsilon. Higher epsilon equals less noise. Lower epsilon equals more noise. For the 2020 Decennial Census product, so for the redistricting data, which is the only product that's been released thus far, epsilon was set to 19.61. This is a very large or very high value of epsilon. A lot of computer scientists would claim that an epsilon above 0.1 is too much, is not enough privacy, not enough noise injected. The Bureau has gone far beyond that particular value to set this to 19.61. And this comes out of kind of analysis that lots of users like our group and others have done. The Bureau has kept moving that epsilon up in order to hit the accuracy targets that users need for various applications such as political redistricting, which is what the redistricting data are for. Prior demonstration products from the Bureau, epsilon was set to 6 or 12.2. So the 19.61 was good in my opinion. If they're going to adopt differential privacy, the higher that epsilon is, that means that the data are going to be more accurate and you're going to get a better representation of who's actually living in your community. The next thing the Bureau has to decide on is how they allocate that privacy loss budget to various geographic levels. And I could talk about this for a couple of hours, and we don't have that kind of time, but in general, the higher the allocation fraction to a particular geographic level, the more accurate the statistics will be for that particular geographic level. So if we look at this allocation fraction, you'll see that the highest allocation fractions go to state, this optimized block group, and we'll talk a little bit more about state and optimized block group in a second, along with the census tract and the county. You'll see that the lowest allocations go to the US or the nation level, as well as the block level. The low allocations to the block level means that the Bureau is willing to sacrifice accuracy of census block statistics in order to get more accuracy for other geographic units, such as counties or census tracts. In prior demonstration products the Bureau had put out, that allocated substantially more accuracy to the block level, but that had other impacts on the quality of the data. So let's talk a little bit more about these two stars, these two geographic levels that I've highlighted, because they're not exactly what you think they are. So the state geographic level is actually not the state as you and I might think of it. In order to provide more accurate statistics for American Indian and Alaska Native and Hawaiian homelands, the Bureau developed a new concept of a state where they broke states up into two parts. They have the part of a state that falls on an American Indian land and a part of the state and the part of the state that falls outside of the American Indian lands. And they essentially divided up states into these two parts, and they processed them separately in their disclosure avoidance system. And this was done in order to provide the more accurate counts for American Indian lands, because before they had done this, the American Indian counts had been quite inaccurate and quite low quality. So in the case of Minnesota, they broke Minnesota up into two parts and processed them separately. And we can see here in the dark gray, the portions that were on AIAN territories and the portions that were outside of those. So when you see the concept of a state, that's what we mean by this. Now, these optimized block groups are super confusing, and I admit I didn't understand fully what these meant until a couple of weeks ago. But the reason that they're using this concept of optimized block group is in order to provide more accurate statistics for cities and townships and county subdivisions and other legal entities that really need fairly accurate statistics. So the Bureau developed this concept of optimized block groups, which are quite different from the block groups that they've typically used in the past. So I want to walk through how these got constructed. So the red polygon here is Hastings City in Minnesota. The blue polygons are the census tracts that overlap with Hastings City. And you can see a fairly low, the tracts do not match nicely with the city of Hastings. So if we were not doing these optimized block groups, we may get more inaccurate statistics for Hastings City. Hastings might be more inaccurate in order to get more accurate tract level statistics. So the Bureau created these optimized block groups to help minimize this problem. What they did is they intersected the cities with the census tracts, and they made up these kind of new entities, and I've highlighted it in pink here, the portion of Hastings City in this particular census tract. And they then took the census blocks that fall within these areas of intersection, and they constructed optimized block groups by essentially aggregating together the blocks that fall within these areas of intersection to construct these optimized block groups. And they used these optimized block groups in their algorithm. And they didn't necessarily keep them contiguous with one another. You can see here that in this example I have, we've got a couple of blocks that are disjoint from the optimized block group is a multi-part feature essentially. But the Bureau did this in order to kind of provide more accurate statistics for these places and townships. And I think this was a good decision on the part of the Census Bureau. After they've done the allocation to geographic levels, they have to decide what statistics, what total population, race, ethnicity, age, they have to allocate privacy loss budget to these particular statistics. And this table is pretty busy, I know, but on the left-hand side, each row is a query in the differential privacy nomenclature. You can see we have a total population query, population by race, population by Hispanic ethnicity, either Hispanic or not Hispanic. And again, the higher the allocation to these queries, the more accurate those counts will be. So I've highlighted here in bold text for a particular geographic level, the US, state, or county, which queries got the largest allocation. So for the US, the largest allocation went to the voting age by race, by Hispanic, by household type query. We see that same thing for the block level, but at the county level, total population received the largest allocation of the query. And as far as I know, the Bureau did a lot of test runs for developing this allocation, but we can quibble with whether or not this was the best allocation, but it's what the Bureau came to with a real focus on redistricting applications. The final decision they made is what counts did not get noise injected into it. These are called invariants. These counts are not subjected to noise injection. In 2020, the invariants are total population at the state level, total housing units at the block level, and a couple of group quarters counts. This was different from 2010. In 2010, the total population at the block level was invariant, as was occupancy status and voting age. So what does this look like in practice? Well, the Census Bureau helpfully has provided a number of demonstration products where they've applied this disclosure avoidance algorithm to the 2010 summary files that we had. So we could compare the 2010 summary file counts with these different demonstration products. And I'm going to show you one example of that today using the June 2021 demonstration product, which is the demonstration product that was created using the same parameters that the Bureau applied to the 2020 redistricting file. So the parameters that I've been showing you with respect to the allocation levels, that's what was used for these June 2021 products. We'll be comparing those 2021 June products with the summary file 1 data. And we're going to be subtracting the June counts from the summary file 1 counts to see what's different. So this is just a quick box plot looking at the raw differences between the differentially private counts and the summary file 1 counts for census blocks in Minnesota. I've binned the census blocks by their 2010 total population count. So we have blocks that are less than 10 people, blocks that are from 10 to 49 people, all the way up to blocks that are greater than 1,000 people. And what you can see here is that for small blocks, the differentially private counts tended to be larger than the summary file 1 counts. We get a negative value for those, and you see kind of the bias is moving upward. So by the time we get to large census blocks, the summary file 1 counts tend to be bigger than the differentially private counts because the raw differences are positive. So for total population, we see this kind of upward bias in the counts, although the magnitude is not particularly high. We're only talking about up to 40 or 60 people for some of these real outlier counts. If we look at the same thing for cities and townships in Minnesota, that bias tends to go away. So we tend to see, I've binned the towns by into 100 to 250, 250 to 500. And here we can see fairly symmetrical distributions around 0. And we don't tend to see that upward bias in total population for city counts. Again, the magnitude of the differences aren't too bad. Although for some of these small population cities, you are looking at count differences that are up to 20% of the population. This is the same, and I know I'm coming to the end of my time now. This is the block level counts for the Black alone population in Minnesota census blocks. Again, we can see that slight upward bias for large blocks, but it's not too bad. And we saw worse bias in prior demonstration products. But again, we're seeing counts that are off by 10 to 20 individuals who are Black alone. This is that same box plot for towns and cities in Minnesota. Not too bad, with one outlier for large cities. This is the difference in Hispanic counts for blocks in Minnesota. Here again, we see that slight upward bias for large blocks in the city, but again, the magnitude of the differences aren't too bad, all things considered. And this is the difference in Hispanic population for large cities in the state of Minnesota, and similar to what we've seen before, slightly larger differences for the big cities, and we can go into detail about why that happens, but we get good symmetricality around 0 at the very least. So thus far, we've only seen these demonstration products for the redistricting data, which doesn't provide full age, sex, race, and Hispanic ethnicity. We should be seeing those in the next few months. We've never seen demonstration data sets for household person join tables. And so hopefully we'll see those to know how good those data are. If y'all want to learn more about this, we have a lot of websites we've been putting these data up on and putting a lot of videos up trying to describe this in more detail. But I'm going to stop now, and we can take a couple of questions if we have time. Otherwise, maybe we'll have time at the end for more questions. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, David, for your excellent presentation. Great timing, very interesting topic. So we will be having a few minutes for taking questions. So before we go to the next presentation. So if you have any question, please speak up or throw it in the chat box.
Looks like John has a question about what impact does all this noise have and how we shouldn't use the redistricted data for drawing new election districts. The Bureau claims that as you aggregate census blocks upward into larger entities, some of this noise will cancel each other out. So a block that is maybe has 10 extra people in it, maybe the adjacent block will have 10 fewer people in it. And so if you aggregate those two together, that plus 10 and minus 10 will cancel each other out, and you'll get the right population. I haven't done too much. I'm not into redistricting. I don't know it that well. I think that generally holds. I think in particular, as you talk about drawing districts for congressional districts or even state legislative and House districts, we're talking about entities that have thousands of people in it. At that level, you're not going to get a ton of inaccuracy. I worry a little bit more about smaller units. If you're drawing school board districts or drawing county commission districts in various entities, where you're only going to get units of a few hundred or a few thousand, that noise might have bigger impact. At the same time, we don't really have much else besides the block level data to work from. And so you're kind of stuck using that as an input. All right. I'm not seeing anything else. So coming on 11:30, if you want to get Todd going.
Yeah, so at this part of the session, I'm going to invite Todd Graham on the stage. He is a principal forecaster at Metropolitan Council. He will be talking, his presentation is entitled as Who Moved My Population? The 2020 Census and Count Question Resolution. So Todd, welcome on the stage.
Thank you, Mohsen. Are you able to see this this slide deck?
Yes, but it's actually not. It's in the presentation mode, but we can see your notes as well.
Let me see if I can. Swap that. Okay. Well, can you guys tolerate this? Is this all right? Because I'm not able to get the cursor up to where the control is for swapping the screens. Okay, we're going to go with this.
It's fine. Yeah.
Thank you, Mohsen, for the introduction. I'm Todd Graham with Met Council. Met Council, many of you know, is a regional planning agency. We operate the buses and light rail system in the metro. We operate wastewater treatment plants that are serving over 1 million households. And way down the list of things we do, you may not know, but we're also the agency assigned to prepare population forecasts for all cities and towns in the metro, and to prepare population estimates in the 9 years out of 10 when there's not a decennial census. So this is agency work that we've been doing for 50 years, and we're very familiar with the dismal, unending task of counting population. We aim to get the numbers right, and that's my motivation for this presentation. Brings me to this topic, 2020 census and count question resolution. This is about getting the numbers as close to right as we can. Here's an outline of what I'm going to present the next 24 minutes. Yeah, the first section of this is front matter or refresher. The first few slides will go fast. Next, I'm going to discuss things that can go wrong with census, which brings us to the main body of this presentation, what local or tribal governments can do about it. Specifically discussing the census's count question resolution process. If you are with a local government, this presentation really is an introduction to that venue for troubleshooting. So some brief recap to begin, really brief. The United States conducts a census, a counting of people every 10 years. Congress assigns this responsibility to the Census Bureau. And last spring, all of us should have received multiple mailings asking us to go online to a secure online census questionnaire and answer 10 questions about ourselves and our households, people we live with. So the online questionnaire is how most people participated. So this is, what I've got here on screen. This is 2020 census viewed from the view of a participating respondent and her cat, I guess. But if you're me and Dave Van Riper, what we really are expecting from the census are the databases that come out the other side. Summary counts of population, households, housing units, with details on demographic characteristics, and available for almost any geography that you would want. This little graphic on the right side of the screen is the census's Census Geography Department's hierarchy of all the summary levels that they tabulate data for, with census blocks being the most basic down there at the bottom of the pyramid. Okay. So all of this is recap. Let's continue. What is available in the way of local data from 2020 census? In August, this past summer, Census released the first huge batch of local data, the so-called redistricting file. And this file has total housing units, total households, also the adult and total populations, with drill down into major race groups. But that's it. That's all they've released so far. Still to come, a year from now, they are the remaining characteristics that would be detailed age, sex, renter or owner status, family or non-family relationships among people living together, and cross tabulations of all those characteristics. At Met Council, where I work, we've received the 2020 data. We've loaded it into our online database. We've prepared some easy to view online reports for cities and townships. We've also published 2 data visualization features. One is an ArcGIS story map about change over the past 30 years. And the other one is a shiny map app about racial diversity across the metro region. Finally, I know this audience primarily GIS professionals. If you want to get your hands onto the data yourselves, we've published excerpts, the Minnesota portion of the database, to the MenGeo website, and that last link on the slide will get you there, or just go to MenGeo and search for Census 2020. That'll find all the relevant shapefiles. Here's a screenshot of that story map I mentioned. You can get to it most easily starting at metrocouncil.org/census 2020. I realize I'm sprinting through this fast. I really do encourage you to explore this on your own time, metrocouncil.org/census 2020. If you're not in the metro area, the Census Bureau itself has a decent online web map on census.gov. I'm not going to promise this is easy to find, but here's the address in the middle of this slide. And then again, if you are a GIS shapefiles, it is available now on MenGeo, that address at the bottom of the slide. Okay. So this has been the front matter. It only took 5 minutes to get through. Now I need to get to, well, in metadata, this is called the warnings, the caveats, the limitations. Decennial Census was a massive data collection campaign, numerous operations, follow-up phases, and you know, things can go wrong. There are aspects of Decennial Census work that lead to inaccuracies or errors, and I've outlined, this is not a comprehensive list, but it's what fits on a PowerPoint slide. These are 6 inaccuracy or error issues that most worry researchers and data pros from the conversations I've had. I've ordered them by the ease or increasing difficulty of finding the problems and correcting the problems. So at the top of this list is boundary lines being wrong. And we will, I'm going to describe in a couple of slides, we will be working with the counties and Census Bureau to remedy those problems where they're discovered. Second problem, situations where addresses were counted, but then were put on the wrong spot on census's map. This is called a geocoding or geolocation error. Easy to understand. Third problem, it is possible that census missed housing altogether. So not that it's on the wrong place on the map, it's not on the map at all. If Census Bureau missed the address, then that address is uncounted. And these are classic undercounts, housing, households, people missed by the census. Fourth problem, I'm now up to point D. Data that was hard to come by could be sketchy. And almost, well, I have here on the slide, 6 to 19% of Minnesota households, Minnesota addresses did not directly respond to the census. Census had to go to secondary sources, including sending census workers out in the field, data mining databases that the federal government has, interviewing neighbors. All of those secondary sources or data mining can yield wrong results, outdated information, and that can lead to undercounts or overcounts. Overcounts are also possible. Fifth problem, and now again, we're increasing in the complexity and rabbit hole nature of this stuff. Errors by respondents themselves. This could be accidental, or it could be deliberate omissions, like census worker comes to the door and you don't want to name everyone who's living in your household, so you don't. How's the census worker going to know? You just want the census worker to take some information and go away. So that can lead to undercounts. There are also respondent errors that can lead to overcounts. Okay, and the final thing on here, Census Bureau has completely rebuilt the disclosure avoidance processing. And after all the raw data has been cleaned up and deduplicated, Census Bureau is taking its proprietary confidential database and it's feeding it through the post process that David described, adding or subtracting small random numbers to frustrate the personal identifiability of population characteristics. So David Van Riper has described all this in the first half of this session. I said a minute ago, I've ordered these issues by the ease or difficulty of the problems. In fact, Census Bureau has a final phase, the very last operation of the 2020 census, to consider corrections for the first three issues, and only the first three issues. Census Bureau calls this the count question resolution process. It's a due diligence and accountability operation that Congress requires. And Congress, its legislative intent was to give states and local governments, tribal governments, an opportunity to question the counts that were released this past summer. And if state or local governments can identify and substantiate problems with the counts in their jurisdictions, census can consider those problems and consider errata corrections. There's a lot of ifs in what I just said. Okay. So now we get to the catch. Census Bureau itself writes the rules for the process and acts as the judge and jury in deciding, okay, what are we going to do about these issues that cities or counties have brought us? So we expect Census Bureau is only going to issue very limited errata corrections. And to get to that point, the problems that governments bring need to be in scope. In scope is meaning that the problem neatly fits into these error types that are the error types of boundary errors or geocoding errors or coverage completeness attributable to a found proven census mistake. What I'm saying is the Census Bureau will only issue errata corrections if they find that they themselves, the Census Bureau, made errors. Like hypothetically, if they did not get around to an apartment building, even though one of our county governments provided them the address 2 years ago, that's an error. On the other hand, if census staff find that the missing apartment building was not an address that it ever had, so it was never in a census database, then they would say, too bad, so sad, you are late to tell us this. If missing addresses were never in a census database, they are going to close that case, refuse to correct the error. They would say that it's not their error, and they will not issue a remedy. So this ends up being really a very high hurdle. Let's skip this slide just in the interest of time. I've said this is a due diligence and accountability operation. If you are a GIS pro with a local government, I recommend that that's how you wade into this. Wade in, evaluate the housing counts and group quarters counts with an eye toward spotting problems, problem identification. If you find no problems, you're done. You're out of the woods. But if you spot problems with census counts and you want to pursue remedies, then you would continue on with the work. My office at my department at Met Council is going to offer technical assistance and also some data resources to local governments in the metro. I'll discuss those a little bit more. The training and assistance that we're going to offer will concern how to substantiate problems, how to bring together evidence that the Census Bureau would be willing to consider, evidence that will not be dismissed or disregarded based on let's call them technicalities. Lots of good stories about technicalities at Census Bureau. But finally, we're going to be offering, as I said, a few data resources to assist the local governments in problem spotting and in substantiation. It's not enough to complain to Census that you just know Greenfield, Minnesota has more than 1,000 homes. Maybe that's something the mayor of Greenfield, Minnesota wants to say, but Census is going to require, show us the evidence of what you think is the right number, an address list or some other database representing the housing stock at the point of first quarter 2020. Lucky for our local governments, Met Council and Metro GIS have that data. Okay, this presentation today, this 25 minutes time slot, got a couple of minutes left, is really not enough to serve as real training, but I am going to describe now the basics of the three issues that Census is considering within scope. First is boundaries errors. We've got a nice map here on the left side of the screen. If you can see this map, you might recognize this is the city of Carver, Minnesota, on the Minnesota River, and the county recognized and state recognized boundaries of Carver, Minnesota are the orange outline that you see in the map. And then the blue outline is what the Census Bureau thought the city boundaries were. They overcounted the area of Carver, Minnesota by about 6,000 acres, which is not a minor trivial amount. It's like 9 square miles that they erroneously took out of the neighboring township and plopped into the census defined Carver, Minnesota. So this is something that Carver County GIS staff have been tearing their hair out about for a while now, and could not get the Census Bureau to correct the problem before these tabulations came out in August. They are going to use the count question resolution process and mechanics to try to finally get the boundaries right and get Census Bureau to correct its published population count for Carver, Minnesota, and also the neighboring township. More generally, boundaries errors. The way to go about finding these errors, substantiating them, is to compare the Census Bureau's boundaries with what you know are the correct boundaries, you can get that from MnGeo or Metro GIS. If it's a small error, you're going to be at the local government level providing a list of addresses that should be included in the political entity that you think has the mistaken tabulation. If it's a large error, maybe you want to go beyond just a list of addresses, and in this case of Carver, Minnesota, provide the list of block IDs that were affected. A couple other things to say here. If there was a late in the decade annexation, provide the case documentation detailing when that annexation took place. But that's not the case with this Carver, Minnesota issue. The Census Bureau just blew it. Where to get data on block boundaries? Cities and towns boundaries are in MnGeo. Also, we've loaded to MnGeo the 2020 census boundaries for blocks and the 2020 census boundaries for counties and cities and so on. And finally, here are a couple other websites listed, the last two bullet points that you can use for reference. The Census Bureau's own collection of the boundaries that they've used, and they have a very neat little web application called an address count listing viewer. You can look at that and very quickly pull up how many housing units, how many group quarters, population were counted in each census block. Next group of issues to talk about are what I call the geolocation, geocoding, and coverage issues. Census Bureau is kind of squad together. It wants to consider these together in the same lane with the same handling when a city or county analyze it in the same workflow. So if you think that the counts are wrong, the count of number of housing units in a block or a larger geography, Census Bureau is going to ask that you provide them the block ID number, provide them what you think is the true or correct number of housing units as of first quarter 2020. And I'm going to add into that, it may not work out, but try also to validate and bring Census Bureau your complaints about group quarters population. We've been getting a lot of signals from Census Bureau the last 4 weeks that they're going to be resistant on correcting group quarters population. I think it's still within a local government's interest to bring up those issues. Substantiating what you think is the true number, substantiate it with whatever administrative records databases you have, address lists, whatever. Ideally, the same data resources that were made available to Census Bureau at the time of the local update of census addresses or subsequent Census Bureau work on assembling its address list. If you think back a couple slides, I was saying Census Bureau is going to be looking at cities and counties' complaints skeptically. There needs to be proof that Census Bureau made an error. And a good example of an error would be a county or a city provided them an address list and somehow Census Bureau disregarded or deleted those addresses. Checking the time. Okay. I said a little bit about group quarters. In the metro area, our agency actually does a group quarters population survey every year. This is separate from the Census Bureau, but we have a list of all the major college dormitories, correctional facilities, and so on. And we do our own survey annually asking for head counts of who is in institutional and other group quarters situations. We also get data for the smaller group home situations, we get that data from Minnesota DHS. So we have this database that you could use for comparison with what Census Bureau believes the group quarters population to be. I think there are going to be a lot of discrepancies there. And it is going to be a higher hurdle to get Census Bureau to make corrections. I've been talking about the data that Met Council has. If you're outside of Metro in the other 80 counties of the state, there's not an annual survey of group quarters. And that's going to put local governments in the situation of having to do some data gathering themselves. Keep in mind, the Census Bureau is going to want to be getting your comments or issues with regard to group quarters population in first quarter 2020. So this becomes almost a historical exercise. Okay, a couple slides left. I've talked about group quarters. If you're looking instead at the coverage of housing units, again, you're going to want to use administrative records, databases that you have within your city hall or your county government. You're going to want that data to be current point in time data from the start of 2020 or first quarter 2020. Anywhere in there is fine. If you're providing instead data that gets more than let's say more than a couple months away from April 1, then Census Bureau, you're giving them an opportunity to say your data is not the same point in time. Again, Met Council can make available to in our local governments in the metro area a database that I'm still working on that will have housing unit counts attached to 2020 parcels data. And we're going to be calling this like an enhanced version. Now we've Met Council and Metro GIS have been publishing parcels data for 18 years now, but you may know if you've used that database, the counties don't always fully populate the dwelling units field in that database. So we're doing a little work on our end to come up with a version of 2020 parcels that can be used for this count question exercise. And then here's just a very quick mock-up of what such a comparison might look like in this on this slide. I've got a map of Washington County, Minnesota in the East Metro, and I've compared what the Census Bureau published as housing unit counts, compared that to what Washington County has in its address points database. And specifically, I've filtered the address points database to only look at the residential properties that were in the database in first quarter 2020. Well, good news for Washington County. All these areas that are green or blue look pretty good compared to the 2020 census counts. There's really only a handful of places in looks like Woodbury, Cottage Grove, and Hugo, Minnesota, where we have a couple of block groups that are red, indicating that the address points database had a few more, 20 to 180 more residential addresses than were counted by Census Bureau. So that would be, this would be a demonstration of where we are pointing Washington County government and its city halls to look with regard to block groups that may have been undercounted. Why may they have been undercounted? Census Bureau had an incomplete address list, or there were new subdivisions or apartment buildings that went in late 2019. Those are the sort of things. Well, in the interest of time, I'm going to wrap up right there, and we'll see if we have 2 minutes for questions and discussions. I can be reached at Met Council if there are people with local governments in the metro who want to ask questions or follow up on any of the opportunities that I've discussed. Technical assistance, data resources.
Well, thank you, Todd, for your excellent presentation. And you're absolutely right. 25 minutes is not definitely enough for talking about these interesting topics. But yeah, we will be having a couple minutes for taking questions. I see already one question in the Q&A box, if that's not answered yet. So Todd, you can probably consider that.
Are we talking about Mark's question? Do you have any thoughts on COVID causing people to relocate? I don't have a lot of thoughts. I don't have a lot of thoughts on that. COVID may have caused people to relocate, but you know, a lot of this is just the churn that happens throughout the year, and the main problem is that the field follow-up work that Census Bureau did didn't happen until summer. It was their data collection efforts were delayed anywhere from 2 to 6 months, depending on the particular operation. Now, the particular problem COVID may have caused is with the closure of higher ed campuses across the country, really. Colleges closing, saying everyone go home or you got to empty out the dorms. A lot of college towns emptied out, college campuses emptied out, and there is a risk that the off-campus housing surrounding campuses could have been seriously undercounted. As for the college students who live in dorms or on campus, what are called group quarters by Census Bureau. Census Bureau, has been insistent, adamant that they've done the job of reaching out to college campuses and all other forms of group quarters and getting those lists of who should have been living there. Whether the data is good remains to be seen. I am encouraging local governments to really scrutinize the college counts and the neighborhoods surrounding colleges. Are there other questions?
Well, if there's no other question, we'll probably wrap it up right here. I just thank you, Todd, for your great presentation, and thank you all participants for your active participation. Two very useful talks, and I just wanted to note that we have recorded this session and we will process the videos and make them available to you shortly. But until then, if you had any questions or concerns or comments, please feel free to reach out. We'll make sure to get you connected to the correct sources. Other than that, yeah, enjoy the rest of the conference and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, Mohsen. Thanks, everybody.